Hello, thank you for joining us. This is Angie Rice with Boutique Travel Advisors, and I'm here with Bonnie from Chubb. And one of the most complex aspects of planning a trip is the risk management associated with protecting your investment. And we recommend to our travelers that they purchase trip insurance, not only to protect their trip and the investment that they've incurred associated with that trip, but also for the medical and medical evacuation coverage and the trip interruption. Insurance has a lot of complexities, whether it's trip insurance or homeowners insurance or car insurance. So I think it's important when you have questions that you always ask the experts. And Bonnie with Chubb Insurance is an expert. She is the VP of Leisure Travel for Chubb. And today she's going to talk to us. It's going to be more of a Q&A session and answer some of the complexities and the questions that many of our travelers ask when it comes time to determine the policies related to their trip insurance. Bonnie, thank you for joining us. Please share with the group your background and a little bit about Chubb as well.
Well, thank you, Angie. It's a pleasure to participate in this session today to help people understand the value of travel insurance. As you mentioned, I'm Bonnie Roshka. I'm Vice President, Head of Leisure Travel for Chubb and their U.S. leisure travel programs. I've been in this industry for nearing 24 years. All I have done is travel insurance, and I'm a frequent world traveler. I've traveled every state in the United States and also to 67 other countries. I've also had the opportunity to experience the travel insurance product personally during trips, from interruptions to medical related situations and some of the common things that occur to a traveler. I also want to point out some of Chubb's history. Chubb has been in the insurance business and has operations in 54 countries and territories. When you think of insurance, you probably always think about the major natural disasters, accidents, large stacks of documents and fine print wording. But when we think about insurance, we think about craftsmanship. And we think about craftsmanship as a way of molding and creating something from scratch and providing travelers with a travel insurance product that's easier to understand and simplified in the travel insurance space, so you know what coverages you have and how the coverages work. So I'm honored to be here and participating with Angie to help answer those questions of the value of travel insurance.
And Bonnie, I know you and I have talked ahead of time and really have delved into some of the questions that really arise with travel. And I think you have questions that arise even prior to your trip, because when it comes to purchasing trip insurance, it's so important that you consider the added value received if you book that trip insurance the same time or near the time of your first deposit towards your trip. We find a lot of times we have travelers that come to us for services and they've already booked their air, let's say. And a couple of months later, they come to us to plan the rest of their trip. And while that's great, they've done the planning ahead of time. But unfortunately, when you book your air and you don't secure trip insurance at that point in time, you miss out on a great benefit that relates to pre-existing conditions. Bonnie, can you kind of give us a little bit of a better understanding of how you can insure trip insurance that includes pre-existing conditions?
Absolutely. One of the things to keep in mind is, as Angie was pointing out, is that travel insurance policies have a specific, you can purchase the policy up until the day before you travel, but you receive additional benefits when you purchase the policy within 15 to 21 days of making your very first initial trip payment. So it's really important and critical that once you're making that very first payment on your reservation, that you make sure to consider the travel insurance purchase within that first 15 to 21 days. So our policies at Chubb, we allow you to purchase within the 15, 21 days, depending on your state of residency. And that would then provide you coverage for the pre-existing medical condition exclusion waiver that Angie was referencing. And this means that because our policies provide coverage for sickness, injury, or death of the traveler, the traveling companion, the traveler's family, and the traveling companion's family, then we would waive pre-existing conditions for all of those individuals if you purchase the policy within 15 to 21 days of your initial trip payment. So it is really important to make that decision right away when you're making that initial payment. But as I did mention, you can purchase travel insurance without that feature up until 24 hours before departure.
And I think also, Bonnie, and you'll know more about this than I do, but one thing to consider when you book your flights, a lot of times people don't know, well, what is my trip going to cost? I don't want to overinsure it. So at that point in time, you can secure your insurance for the amount that you can be on the lower end side of what you think your trip is going to cost and what you need to insure, and you can always update that policy if the trip costs increase. Is that correct, Bonnie?
Yeah, so you only need to insure the actual prepaid non-refundable trip costs that at the time. So if you come and you book the cruise or a tour and you put down that deposit, you have to insure the prepaid non-refundable costs you've paid within the 15 or 21 days, depending on the plan that you're looking at purchasing. When you go and add on airfare or other shore excursions or other trip components, you get another 15 or 21 days to increase your policy coverage. So you don't have to guess as to how much should I insure. You just are insuring how much you've paid on the reservation at that time. And then when you make additional payments in the future, you have that same amount of time again to increase your policy coverage.
Another question that comes up quite often during the discussion of the value of trip insurance is an understanding of what's covered under trip insurance. Could you kind of elaborate on the different components that are oftentimes included in a policy?
Absolutely. One of the things to keep in mind is most of the travel insurance programs out there offer a very comprehensive package, and that's what's being offered by you and your travel advisors. Is those packages include trip cancellation for specific covered reasons listed on the policy. They have trip interruption coverage, meaning if you start your trip and you need to catch up or come home early for that same list of covered reasons on the policy. They include coverage for trip delay, which is your trip gets delayed for covered reasons on the program for additional lodging costs, meals, ground transportation costs that you didn't expect because you're delayed more than a certain amount of time. They include coverage for baggage and your personal effects that you take with you while you're traveling, or if your bags don't arrive to your destination on time and your bags are delayed and you need to purchase essential items. But the main core component is they provide coverage for medical and emergency medical transportation while you're traveling. So in the event you have a slip and fall, you end up having a heart attack, or you end up having a serious medical situation, there is actual medical coverage and emergency medical transportation on that policy as well to assist you with those costs, especially when you're traveling out of country. Or even if you're traveling just within the United States, you might have deductibles and more out of pocket because you're out of your actual home network for your medical insurance, that the travel insurance is there to help take care of those additional costs that you wouldn't have covered under your personal insurance programs.
And on the topic of the coverage related to the medical and medical evacuation, I believe that there's typically Chubb and other insurance providers will offer a variety of different products to help determine the needs and wants of a particular traveler. So there's policies that have maybe $25,000 worth of coverage and other policies that have $50,000 worth of coverage related to medical expenses. And obviously there's going to be an increase in price associated with the plan that offers more coverage. Is that correct, Bonnie?
Yes, each company offers a variety of products. So we at Chubb have 3 single trip plans that you buy on a per trip basis, and we also have 3 annual plans that you purchase on an annualized basis. Each of them have different limits of coverage, and one of the specific items with Chubb is we make sure that each of those plans have the exact same fine print, meaning the same covered reasons under trip cancellation, interruption, trip delay, to make it easier for you to make a choice of how much limits of coverage do I need. Example, on the medical expense, like you were talking about, do I need 25,000 in medical expense or 50,000? Some of the people choose different levels of coverage depending on where they're traveling. If I'm doing just a domestic trip, I'm not going to have as high of medical coverage on my policy because I have personal insurance that's going to cover me most. I'm just looking for coverage for my deductibles and out-of-pocket expenses because I'm out of my network. If I'm traveling to Europe or to Africa or Australia, I would be looking at more medical coverage on my travel insurance policy because my personal insurance likely is not going to provide the coverage while I'm traveling international. So, and if I'm doing something very remote, I would be looking more toward the top of the line programs that have the highest limits of medical coverage, because I'm in a very remote area and an emergency transportation could be much more expensive if I have that need during that travel.
And we talked about sort of the different types of coverage you receive under policy, from costs associated with trip interruption, costs associated with protecting your travel expenses if you have to cancel, and the medical evacuation costs. But let's really dive into what is a covered reason, because I think there's a lot of complexities associated with what is a covered reason in terms of if you have a claim and it's being evaluated, what are the covered reasons that will ultimately determine whether a claim is reimbursable under a policy?
Yeah, great question. Great question. And this does vary across the industry, but most of the policies have at least 15 to 20 different covered reasons listed on the program. The most common ones that I get questions on, of course, is that we're providing coverage for sickness, injury, death of not only the traveler or traveling companion, it's also the traveler or traveling companion's family. And family is everybody except cousins. So it's your aunts and uncles and nieces and nephews. So if somebody ends up getting sick or injured, or a last minute they're in a traffic accident, now they're hospitalized and you need to stay home, or they had a heart attack, or they get diagnosed with COVID, COVID is treated like any other medical condition. But they also have covered reasons such as weather-related cancellation. If your residence or destination becomes uninhabitable due to natural disaster, if you're in the military and you're leaving, your orders get changed, and now your orders change that you can't take that vacation. Also, there's coverage for terrorist incidents if there's a terrorist incident in a city you're scheduled to travel to or through within 30 days. But there's several reasons on the program, but your most common are the sickness, injury, death, or weather-related problems. You never know how the weather is going to impact your travel. It all comes down to the airline flight patterns. So anytime I see weather on the news station, you don't know how that's going to impact your particular flights. I may be in a part of the country for the US that's having beautiful weather today, but if my plane is coming out of an area that has hurricane weathers or major snowstorms in the wintertime, my flight may not go off as scheduled. So it's really important component on the policies is the weather coverage. Most of the claims and everything that associate that people have occur to them on a day-to-day basis is your sickness coverage and weather-related coverage are the main two components.
That's so true, Bonnie. And you've talked about personally having to file a claim under your trip insurance policy. I've had to do the same. In fact, I'm in the process of putting together documentation. I came home from a trip to Costa Rica. Our flight was canceled due to weather in Dallas, and we had to overnight. It also resulted in order to get home in time to relieve my sister from watching my children. We had to choose a different airline. We also purchased a hotel for the night, and I, had a quick conversation with the claims adjustment team and was basically told to submit, the portion of my unused airfare as well as my meals, my hotel accommodations, and my new airfare. So all of that will be considered for reimbursement under my policy, and obviously my policy limits will play a part as well in terms of what's reimbursed. So, weather happens quite frequently, and some policies are very generous as it relates to what constitutes a delay or cancellation where you can recover expenses. I also had an incident on our trip to Croatia where my husband and my niece's luggage was lost for over 3 days. And we were able to purchase the items that they needed, and all of that was fully reimbursed under our policy. So those are little examples, but at the same time, you're not just protecting that trip for those little incidences that might result in a claim. You're also ensuring all of the different probabilities that may result in a cancellation or a delay of your trip. And when you're planning trips, far out in advance, sometimes I think that those are some of the most critical trips to insure, because there's a longer window of uncertainty related to whether or not you may result in a cancellation. Bonnie, there was one other type of policy coverage that I want to talk to you about, because this comes up quite a bit as well. Do insurance policies, or are there policies available that cover work-related cancellations?
Yes, there's policies that are out there that have work-related cancellations, whether your company goes through a merger acquisition product recall, if it's just generalized that your boss needs to cancel your vacation because you're a key essential employee. So those situations do come up. They don't come up quite as often, but they do come up from time to time, and it is a named peril on most policies in the industry.
And because we work with a lot of professionals, and they're either in high demanding positions like working as an attorney, or they are first responders where they have had issues with being able to travel as planned, particularly during the pandemic. And I know the pandemic itself isn't a reason for cancellation, but if someone truly cannot leave work, what typically is the documentation that would be required under a claim related to cancellation due to work-related issues?
This will vary across the industry in regards to how it's worded within a particular policy. When looking specifically at the Chubb policies, if your boss cancels your vacation, a manager or director or your employer has to sign a notarized statement indicating that they did pre-approve your vacation and since had to cancel it, and provide some very basic general reasoning as to needing to cancel your vacation. So we try to keep it as simple as possible. It's a simple notification from your employer outlining you're a key employee and that you need to cancel the vacation due to a work obligation.
Thank you for explaining that. And thank you for explaining that, Bonnie. And you also talked about the different types of plans as being the opportunity to insure a single trip, but you also mentioned annual plans. And at Boutique Travel Advisors, we have a concierge program where we have clients who travel quite frequently throughout the year, as well as they plan for long-term travel. So they're part of our concierge service program. And many of the times in their cases, it's very advantageous to look at annual plans. So could you elaborate on the benefits of an annual plan and when it might be a better option for one type of traveler versus another?
Absolutely. I actually utilize both plans. So I actually purchase the annual plans. Our plans are referred to as multi-trip plans. But the annual plan is really good for somebody that's a frequent traveler. I travel a lot around the United States, so I have my annual plan in force for any time I'm out there traveling. But then I always purchase a single trip plan whenever I'm doing that one big vacation or my big vacation of the year, because the annual plans aren't driven toward the trip cancellation component of the policy. They're really driven more toward the trip interruption, trip delay, baggage, medical, emergency medical. So the trip cancellation portion actually has a cap limit. So I always make sure to have my annual plan, because I travel all the time. Prior to last year, I was traveling 85% of the time, and majority of that within the United States. So I always had my annual plan in place. But whenever I was going on my own personal vacation and doing that big vacation where I was spending more money toward that one luxury trip I do a year, I always buy a single trip plan for that particular trip, because I have much more invested in that particular vacation. And I want to make sure that I have the right amount of trip cancellation coverage along with all the other benefits of the policy. So I do encourage people to look at what works best for their situation and how they travel. But people that aren't frequent travelers would likely just purchase the single trip policy whenever they're booking a trip. But people that are frequent, whether they're traveling on business or personal, I travel quite a bit because I have family all across the country. So I do a lot of business and personal travel. And that's why I make sure I have both plans available to me at all times.
You're right. With the annual plan, it's not as much of a focus on covering 100% of your trip costs. It's more of a focus of having that coverage. When someone travels a lot, purchasing single plans for each and every trip can be cost prohibitive. But like Bonnie said, there are those particular trips that really need the supplemental coverage because it's such a large investment. And Bonnie, I think we kind of talked about how the front end as it relates to planning for trip insurance, determining the policy that is best suited for for the traveler. And one thing that I also want to highlight is the benefit of looking at a policy from the standpoint of if you're a family, and a lot of times people might think that it's going to be more costly to insure a family, but aren't there oftentimes benefits to insuring children at no additional cost?
So some plans in the industry do have family coverage programs. So our programs for our single trip plans at Chubb do have a children component in the policies that children can be included as long as all the adults are purchasing the policy. So it does vary quite a bit across the industry. So you really just have to put in your specific trip information in order to get a quote on the travel insurance policy. But several companies have a family package option available.
And when you're traveling with groups, there's that opportunity to consider, is it more advantageous to purchase a group plan, or is it more value added, or is it better for each family or each individual within a group to have their own policy? Could you talk a little bit about the benefits of a group policy and when it makes sense and when it may not make sense for a group traveling together?
Well, one of the things to keep in mind is when you're looking at a group policy, you have to look at the conditions of the group policy. Some group policies out there indicate that every single person in that group has to have coverage, and other group programs out there still allow it to be individual optional decision for each of the group participants. So it does vary on how you term group policies. But ultimately, when you're looking at it, I think it's every person's choice in regards to what they need for travel insurance, how much limits of coverage they need for travel insurance, dependent on how their personal insurance works. And it's best to work with their travel advisor to get the quote and find out the information. Once they receive the quote, then call the travel insurance company directly to ask all those questions specific regarding the plans and which plan is best for them.
During the pandemic, we've learned that in order to travel to certain destinations, trip insurance is required. And I think if you know that this is going to be required, obviously, the sooner you purchase it, you're insured for a longer period of time. Could you kind of talk about sort of the new trend in different destinations requiring trip insurance to be purchased by travelers in order to travel, and why this trend is occurring?
Believe it or not, Angie, I'm impressed with this question. And the reason I am is before 2020 occurred, there were several countries that did mandate you had medical insurance verification of travel insurance for medical coverage before you could travel to that country and receive a visa to travel to that country. However, now because of the pandemic, we are seeing a lot more countries putting requirements out there. And we encourage everybody to work with their travel advisor or make sure they review the country-specific requirements of traveling to that country, because the rules have all changed. We are seeing more countries that are stating you have to have validation from the travel insurance provider that you have medical insurance and that COVID-19 is treated just like any other medical condition, and have that verification before you can do country entry. But there are still countries even before the pandemic that did mandate you had to have at least so much medical coverage for medical insurance while in that country as well. So all the travel insurance companies have made sure that they have the correct policy wording, the validation of coverage, because of all the new countries that are starting to require a certain, and they're all putting a different level of medical expense limits on them, and they do vary by country. Some countries are saying 25,000 in medical expenses required. Some are saying 50,000. Some of the European countries are going to say a minimum of 30,000 euros, which is about 40,000 in US dollars. So work closely with your travel advisor, check the state required documentation in regard. Travel.state.gov is a great reference to find out country specific requirements, but definitely pay attention to what those requirements are before you decide which travel insurance policy you're going to purchase.
You're right. It's very similar. I've heard some stories about people who've traveled and they've taken the wrong COVID test. It's very similar to not reading the fine print. So if you purchase a policy and you haven't read that fine print related to the requirements of a particular country, you might have purchased a policy that doesn't meet the requirements. So it's important to kind of investigate that on the front end. And certainly, Janet and I, as we assist our clients with travel insurance and we work with our travel provider partners like Chubb, we're able to reconcile that at time of purchase to make sure that you're provided the coverage and plan that is required. And another really important thing, as much as we want to avoid any events while traveling that result in an injury or some sort of interruption to our trip, I think it's important to really address what to do when something like that happens. Like, how do we interface with Chubb or our insurance company to help assist us when we're in travel? Could you kind of elaborate on that, Bonnie?
Absolutely, because I've actually experienced this myself when I've traveled. The first thing I will tell everybody whenever you're getting a travel insurance policy, you should always look at what's covered under the policy and then look at what's not covered under the policy, just to make sure you're fully aware of every travel insurance policy out there has a list of exclusions and things that are not covered. But when something happens to you while you're traveling, the first thing to do, and I can't stress this enough, is to call the 24/7 assistance hotline available by that travel insurance provider. Make that phone call. They will be able to assist you and provide guidance in regards to what you need to do when that situation happens. An example, when I was in Belize, I fell down the stairs. I thought at the time I had broke my arm. My first call was to the 24/7 assistance center. I've fallen. I need assistance getting to a medical facility. I believe I broke my arm. I need to have x-rays. I don't know if I want to leave the trip yet and go home. I just need to find out what I've done to me based on this fall. They went ahead and coordinated all of my transportation arrangements to the medical facility, coordinated all of the payments directly with that medical facility on my behalf. And made sure to help guide me with all of my options in regards to the travel insurance. And as I stated earlier, travel insurance gives you a choice. When something happens, you then have a choice. So in my situation of my fall, I had the choice because I had a slip and fall, and I did have medical injury because of that slip and fall, that I could stay on the trip, or I could say, you know what, I just want to go home and recover at home. I made the deal with my spouse. If I broke my arm, I'm going home. If I haven't broke it all the way through, clean break, and it's just injured, I'm going to stay. So it allowed me the choice of making some decisions. But the first and foremost thing is call that 24/7 assistance center, because they'll be able to guide you through anything that's going on and the amount of assistance they provide to help you through any issues that happen while you're traveling.
And we've had some travelers be similar to your case, Bonnie, where they've been injured while traveling and they've needed medical help. And oftentimes, that phone call it's almost like an addition to 911. Certainly, if you need to, immediate help, you're going to want to call 911 or, seek medical emergency treatment. But at the same time, if you have the ability or someone who's traveling with you to access the 24-hour hotline, you can also get assistance with finding where you need to go to receive that medical treatment. So it's great to know that you're not only getting your trip costs potentially covered under a claim, but you're also getting that much needed assistance during an unforeseeable event like an injury. And Bonnie, I wanted to also kind of just elaborate, really quickly, like just to kind of summarize some of the things we talked about. Really, what would be like the 3-4 things to really take away from this conversation to really help travelers as it relates to what they need to consider when it comes time to book a trip and evaluate and make the decision on what trip insurance to purchase for their trip?
The main things they want to keep in mind is what type of trip are you booking, and what level of investment have you put into the trip? How much trip cancellation coverage do you truly need? You're only required to insure the prepaid non-refundable trip costs. Do you want coverage for cancellation at all, or do you just want coverage for while you're traveling for the expenses that could occur while you're traveling? But ultimately, it's everybody's choice on what they're looking for travel insurance. But the most important thing right now in everything that's going on around the world is rules are changing all the time, frequently from one country destination to another country destination in regards to what the requirements are for you to travel to that country. So my number one takeaway is to stay close with your travel advisor, to make sure you understand what the requirements are and did they change from the time you booked to when you're actually getting ready to travel. But to really consider travel insurance for all the things that might happen while you're traveling. You never know when you're going to get in a traffic accident. You never know when you're going to have a heart attack. You never know when these things are going to happen. And when it happens while you're traveling, you want to have that 24/7 assistance line right there to be able to contact and say, help me through this process, help me with all the expenses for the medical expenses, emergency medical transportation. But bags get delayed, flights get rerouted, flights get canceled. Most of the time it's due to weather related situations going on, a lot of the times. And then you have additional expenses you didn't expect because of those additional delays, things to that nature. So it is really something to consider, and just look closely at which policy and what limits of coverage you're comfortable in having to make sure that you're protecting your investment on that trip.
Thank you so much, Bonnie. And a lot of times there's, like you said, there's different policies for a reason, and you play a big part in determining the products that are available and the offerings by Chubb. And I think as our travelers, really, it's case by case in the sense that you might need one plan for one trip and you need to consider a different plan for another. And you may have a given year where it makes sense to have an annual plan, and other years where you might be traveling less or to a place where it's US based and you're comfortable with the medical coverage that you have under your existing health insurance. So it is complex. And I always say, Bonnie, if my clients have questions, that let's just get you on the phone and find a rep that can really answer those questions directly, because the expertise of an industry expert, whether it's working as a travel advisor versus an insurance advisor, those are two different things. And we're really here to kind of guide our clients towards making the right decisions. But if they have very, very specific questions, we always advise that we connect directly and get those questions answered. But I do feel today we did a great job of answering a lot of the common questions that are asked by our clients when it comes time to make the investment in trip insurance, because it is a costly investment. But hopefully today we really clarified for you why it's so important to make this investment as part of your trip. And we oftentimes say that when you really look at a budget for planning a trip, that it ought to have the trip insurance incorporated into the total cost that you plan to spend on your trip. So thank you again, Bonnie, for joining us today. And if anyone has any questions in the replay, just leave them in the comments and we'll be sure to get those questions answered.
Thank you so much, Angie. And it's an honor to be partnered with you. Anything we can do to assist your clients in answering any questions, all they have to do is give Chubb a call, and we're more than happy to answer any questions they have regarding our programs.
Be a question being asked right now that I want to make sure that we have answered. One travel asked, is there a way to communicate with Chubb using WhatsApp? Is that a technology that's available?
I know I've utilized WhatsApp, and we can definitely further look into that with our assistance center. I don't believe our assistance center utilizes it right now, but I've utilized it in the past. So I will confirm that information for you, Angie, and talk to our assistance center and see if that's something they can add to their communication opportunities.
And we just had a traveler share with us that their trip was they had a cancellation on their return as well, similarly to I did. So I think it's important to recognize that happens frequently, and there can be a lot of costs associated with an interruption. So insurance is great for that. And, as much as we hope for the best and that trips go as planned, we have travelers that unfortunately, particularly I emphasize to people, you really have to assess your family situation. If you have aging parents or you have parents that have pre-existing conditions, those are things that can be covered if you purchase your insurance timely. And we all have greater probabilities associated with our families that would be, part of the overall coverage. I planned several group trips, and each individual, I'll give as an example, where I have some friends who no longer have aging parents. Their parents have passed away, so they don't have to emphasize the coverage associated with something happening to their elderly parents. Whereas other friends of mine and clients who travel do have, parents, and they worry about a need to cancel due to the health of their parents. So, it is very case by case. So again, thank you everyone who tuned in. Bonnie, you were a great resource, and we appreciate having you today. Thanks again.
Thank you.